left to right, Ozzy Osbourne, Bill Ward, Tony Iommi, and Geezer Butler. What's so funny sometimes looking back at these old newspapers, how often they have it just completely wrong. Hey, we're going to continue with our Ozzy-themed shows today, and I have something that I think you're really going to enjoy. This is kind of a little bit of a time capsule, especially related to Black Sabbath. And what it is back in the 1970s, in 1975 and 1978, Rolling Stone did a feature on Black Sabbath, did a couple different articles, and these articles were then distributed across the country and printed in newspapers all over the United States. And what I did is I actually found these two different articles, the one from 75, one from 78, and what I'm going to do today is I'm just going to read these to you because they're really interesting to hear what was being written about them at the time. So this first one, the version I'm going to read is from the Dayton Daily News. And like I said, these things were printed all over the country in newspapers far and wide. And so this one, it says Rolling Stone profile, Black Sabbath. And then it's really interesting. The subhead that they put here is, sorry, folks, they really aren't weirdos. They're sweet, charming, totally unpretentious young people. Now, that first part's kind of interesting when you hear the word young, because although they were young in a sense, these guys are getting up into their later 20s at this point, because basically the three of them, Bill, Tony, and Ozzy, were all born in 1948, and Geezer was born in 1949. So when Black Sabbath came together, in 68, when they were really starting to get moving, basically they were 20 years old. And by the time they get to this point in 1975, these guys are 27 and 26. And so they're getting up into their later 20s. And so because they're a little further into their career at this point. And one thing before I read this is kind of interesting is they print this picture in the newspaper, and it says Black Sabbath left to right. And look at the picture here while I'm reading this. Left to right, Ozzy Osbourne, Bill Ward, Tony Iommi, and Geezer Butler. Now, what's really funny about this, it's a little blurry, and when you have these old pictures that are blurry, it's a little bit hard sometimes to tell the difference between Tony and Geezer, because they both had those mustaches and the long hair, and then with sunglasses on, it's very, when it's blurry, it's tough. When it's not blurry, it's really easy, but I believe what the picture really is Tony Iommi's on the left, not Ozzy. Bill Ward, they have that one correctly. And then it's Geezer, not Tony, that's the next one there. And then, of course, Ozzy's the last one, even though they say it's Geezer. And what's so funny sometimes looking back at these old newspapers, when they print these pictures, how often they have it just completely wrong. And this is an example of it where it's just totally off. Okay, so again, I think you're going to enjoy listening to this. This was printed on August 31st of 1975. And so to put this in context, this is right after the album Sabotage has come out, because Sabotage was released on July 28th of 1975. So this is, just about a month after that album comes out. All right, Los Angeles. Black Sabbath is back on tour after more than a year's absence, this time with an expanded show, a 30-city string of, as usual, sellout concerts, a new album, Sabotage, and new managers themselves. And that whole manager thing, they talk a little bit about it here, but this was such a tumultuous time for the band because of this whole manager and legal problems, figuring out that they'd been being ripped off all this time, that they were getting a kind of an allowance from pay, but they were not making the money that they should have been making. So this was a very, very challenging time for the band. Over the last 3 years, Sabbath had become literally sick and tired of touring. Drummer Bill Ward had contracted hepatitis. Vocalist Ozzy Osbourne thought he was going crazy. And actually right around this time, for a brief period of time, he actually did check himself into an asylum because he was having some real issues. Bassist Geezer Butler had developed a kidney stone, and guitarist Tony Iommi thought he would simply never recover from his physical exhaustion. Quote, after doing all those strenuous tours, Iommi said, we needed the time to sit back and look at what we were doing. We were losing all the content, didn't know what was happening at all musically. And like I said, this was a really challenging time for the band. There's so many moving parts, so many issues outside the band that were putting pressure on them in different ways. So this was a big deal. Sabbath retreated to their homes in the English countryside and stayed there for a year, leaving only for one tour of Australia and to work on Sabotage, their 6th album on Warner Brothers. Meantime, rumors surfaced in this country about lawsuits and threats and general unhappiness between the Sabbaths and manager Patrick Meehan, who had assumed direction of the group about 4 years ago. And what I was saying a minute ago, between Patrick Meehan and the group, this is where a lot of these challenges started. They began realizing what he was doing from a management standpoint. They ended up firing him, and it just cost them a small fortune dealing with him, dealing with all the lawsuits, the legal issues that were happening. And as a matter of fact, it became such a big deal. They talked about how they were in the studio recording Sabotage, and they were regularly dealing with lawyers. I mean, people were literally bringing them documents into the studio, legal documents, things they had to deal with were happening on a regular basis. And as a matter of fact, so much so that they actually wrote a song called The Writ. And it's an interesting song because it was the lyrics, which was kind of a different thing, were actually written by Ozzy, which he didn't do a lot in the band. It was usually Geezer that wrote the lyrics. But this one was a direct response to their manager that they were dealing with. It had all these legal issues, so they literally wrote a song called The Writ that was, for all intents and purposes, an attack on Patrick Meehan, their manager. So let's see here. Whatever differences did exist were apparently settled out of court. Meehan reportedly still gets a piece of the record royalties, but the group controls its own destiny, and that's all they will say about it. Now, interestingly, I think it's in Geezer Butler's book, Into the Void, where he talks just a little bit about this, about the settlement, and what he says is that they basically settled out of court for $1 million with Patrick Meehan just to make the whole thing go away. And they were having financial struggles all through this time anyway, and then that just made it worse, that they had to basically borrow money from the record company to pay him off. And anyway, they were paying lawyers constantly, and they were actually, when you read their books and listen to them, there was this part of them like, why do we even bother doing any of this stuff? Because basically all we're doing is making money to pay off attorneys. So anyway, it was just a really very, very difficult time for the band. Let's see here. Whatever differences, that's all they will say about it. Okay. Before launching their current tour in mid-July, the group rehearsed in Los Angeles and did a few interviews at Ben Frank's, a Sunset Strip coffee shop. Iommi ordered a plain omelet and orange juice and conscientiously dropped Sweet and Low into his coffee. Quote, "Got fat laying about," he smiled, if recording can be called laying about. And the issue here was that the amount of time it took putting that album together, that's kind of what he's referring to, is that they were just stuck. So Sabotage was, compared to their other efforts, a positively leisurely album. Quote, "It took quite a while," Iommi admitted, "but the actual studio time wasn't that long," unquote. It may have been too long for Osbourne, though. He told one reporter, quote, "If I hear this thing again, I'll shoot myself," unquote. And again, the point was, the amount of time they actually spent recording it, actually in the studio being productive, when compared to all the other things that they were dealing with, probably wasn't that big a percentage, or at least as much as it seemed like it would have been. Because they said that whenever they weren't in the studio, they were either playing a show or they were in an office or somewhere dealing with an attorney. That's all they were doing at this time. The new album, Iommi said, is a return to the Black Sabbath of yore, back to basic roots. That means hardcore rock, no more fiddling with orchestras and fancy embellishments as on Sabbath Bloody Sabbath. Sabotage has the old familiar end-of-the-world motif, although the group did relent and add a choir and some keyboards. Now, this is an interesting thing, because this is the album they had that song Super Tsar on it. And that song is just, it's an incredibly ambitious piece of music. And it is just filled with these choirs and some really cool guitar work in it too. But this is, if you ever hear that kind of legendary story where Ozzy walked into the studio late, notoriously, walked into the studio and saw all these people there. This lady, he said, that was like an 80-year-old woman playing a harp, and this massive choir of people. He thought he was in the wrong place. He walked in, sees all these people, turns around, leaves. Anyway, that legendary story, that's what it was about here, from that song, and where they'd had all of these people in there in this choir, because Tony Iommi had apparently been working this song out on a Mellotron, I think at his house. And if you're familiar with the Mellotron, it was, although it wasn't a synthesizer, it kind of served a similar purpose because it was a keyboard that would create all these different sounds. But it was actually, instead of being generated by circuits, the sounds were being generated by actual tape. And a Mellotron, when you'd play a key on a Mellotron, it would actually push a playhead down and drag a tape across a playhead, and it lasted about 7 seconds. And then you'd let up, and a spring would pull the tape, and then you could play the note again. And so a lot of people would use these for strings, for choirs, for flutes. And there were a lot of bands. I mean, everybody from Led Zeppelin to David Bowie, and probably the one that you'd know the most that used a Mellotron was the Moody Blues. Mike Pinder, the keyboardist for the Moody Blues, was notorious for using the Mellotron in even live. And matter of fact, a lot of bands use it live, but I mean, there were just so many people that use this. But anyway, I didn't mean to get off on that, but Tony Iommi had worked out this stuff on a Mellotron, and then he thought, hey, let's try this for real. And then that's how you ended up with Superstar on the album Sabotage. So in fact, a keyboard player, Jez Woodruff, is accompanying them on this tour, the first such musical addition since the group formed 7 years ago. He hasn't joined the group. He's just over here with us to add the sound, says Iommi, who plays keyboards on Sabotage. He only plays about 3 numbers, but he's carrying a tremendous amount of keyboards. You'd think he was doing the Philharmonic. Now, for me, the first time I'd ever heard the name Jez Woodruff was because I discovered Black Sabbath much later, was on Robert Plant's solo albums. And if you bought Pictures at 11, you'll remember, you pull the sleeve out and you'll see Jez Woodruff's name right there. Sabbath's new show is 2 hours long and about a half hour longer than last year's presentations. They've added a fancy shell in back of Ward's drum kit and some intricate lighting. Quote, "We wanted to do more," Iommi said, "but we just didn't get it organized in time," unquote. And again, of course, because of all the different things they were dealing with, recording that album took way, way longer than they'd planned. And they had scheduled the tour while they were recording Sabotage, not thinking it was going to take as long as it did. So the tour started so fast after they finally finished the record, they just didn't have time to put together all the things that they were planning on doing. This year's act is somewhat more restrained than the spree-spending lifestyle Sabbath adopted after their early success. Country mansions, Rolls Royces, Lamborghinis, as well as the unexpected scorn of their old croonies and the unwanted leeching of new, quote, friends. Let's see here. Quote, "This business does affect you in a way, but you don't realize it," unquote, Iommi said rather sadly. "At one time, we didn't even go down to the local pub because we felt uncomfortable. We felt we had to act like pop stars. Now it's great. I can do anything I like." Iommi attributes this newfound confidence to rural life and the reduced pressure to conform. Iommi told one English writer who paid a visit to Tony's 200-room Kilworth house and was quite startled to see expensive paintings and porcelain figures. Quote, "He said it didn't fit my image. What did he expect? Everything painted black?" Unquote. Right, that's exactly what people expect of this group. Ominous darkness, relieved only by gold crosses and occult mutterings, all shrouded in a drug-riddled haze. Well, no. They do have more than a passing interest in the occult, but it's the sort of naive interest that's easily satisfied by seeing The Exorcist 8 times, as Osborne has. Iommi has been reading books by Lobsang Rampa and on astral projection, but that's not scary. They are simply not weirdos. They're sweet, charming, totally unpretentious people. And it's this contrast between them and their music that's the fascinating thing about them. One weekend several years ago, they played the Whiskey in LA dressed in white ties, tails, top hats, and canes, and came bouncing onto the stage grinning at themselves. It was a rare moment, a heavy metal, fire and brimstone group having fun and poking fun. So much for being sinister. Besides, there's absolutely nothing sinister about a slightly overweight Ozzy Osbourne galumphing around a stage in bright Superman tights, waving peace signs and shouting, "We love you," while the band thunders along like the Grim Reaper. Quote, "We tend to give another impression on stage," Iommi said. "We get carried away ourselves," unquote. Critics who have hated Sabbath in the past, and they are legion, probably won't be won over this time either. But Sabbath keeps packing in crowds and selling records, critics be damned. And it's interesting that they talk about Ozzy and the clothes that he'd wear on stage, because this album, Sabotage, is also one of those legendary album covers that they absolutely hated. Now, it depends on who you listen to, how they ended up with that album cover. But the idea, they're sitting in front of a mirror and you're basically seeing the wrong side of their reflection in the mirror when you look at the cover. But according to Geezer Butler's book, he said that when they showed up, that they were going to be doing. The guys in the band thought they were going to be doing some sort of test photo, and I think, as I recall from Tony Iommi's book, they showed up, but they just weren't prepared. That they knew they were getting photos taken, but they just dressed and didn't really talk about what they were going to wear. Didn't come ready. And the one thing they do agree on, though, speaking of the Superman tights, is that the pants that Bill Ward is wearing were from his wife. They are these really funny looking things, and then when you look at what Ozzy's wearing, they just don't look like a cohesive unit. And you listen to those guys talk about it, and they just say they've been relentlessly made fun of over the years because of what people say is one of the worst album covers ever made. Now, me personally, I don't see it that way. I mean, it is a little silly, but I kind of love the weirdness of it. The what Ozzy's wearing, what Bill's wearing, the other guys. I mean, Tony's sitting down, and it's just because for me, I always kind of like these snapshots in time and kind of the weirdness that comes in moments like that. And so there's this part of it that I find a little bit charming in just how strange and goofy it ended up. But anyway, you be the judge of that. But the guys in the band certainly were not fans of what came from that. Okay, unlike other groups in similar situations, Sabbath isn't arrogant. They don't actually say, "Damn the critics." Quote, "We're not the best thing in the world," Iommi said. "We really enjoy it, and that's what counts." And which is isn't that kind of a funny thing listening to them? It's actually almost a weird symbol of their self-confidence, maybe, or how comfortable they were in their own skin, because here is Tony Iommi. They're this, at this point, this legendary band. They're a big deal, and his attitude is like, "Well, we're not the best thing out there." And you think, can you imagine other bands saying something like that? There's so many other groups that just have so much arrogance about them that you just could never imagine them making statements like that. So anyway, there's something charming about that interesting humility that these guys had, where they were very comfortable in who they were and they weren't afraid to say things like that. Okay, so that's the first one. That's the Rolling Stone article from 1975. Now, there's another one here that is really interesting, and this one's from 1978. And this is another Rolling Stone feature about Black Sabbath, and this one is about the time that they come out with the album Never Say Die. That's the one that we're dealing with here, which is, it's so fascinating because you're talking about just a few years later. You're talking about going from 75 to 78, and so many things changed during that period. I mean, they started having so many more problems. And when you look at Sabotage, one of the things that they talk about is that because they were being attacked so much from so many different directions, from lawyers, their former manager, all the different issues they were dealing with. Interestingly, it brought them closer together as a group. It made them a stronger, more cohesive group of people because they started really feeling like the world was attacking them. The world was closing in around them, and they were them against the world, which strengthened their bonds while they were putting together the album Sabotage. And why this is so fascinating is here we are 3 years later, putting out the Never Say Die album, and it has completely changed from that point where they are ready to fall apart. And as a matter of fact, before they even recorded the album, at one point, Ozzy actually quit. And what's kind of fascinating about it is Ozzy was getting so kind of, fed up with the band himself, even though they were all having so many substance abuse problems. They kicked Ozzy out, but he had actually quit before they started recording the album. And he had this attitude like, I'm going to go do my own thing. He'd even talked to Geezer about the two of them putting a band together. But Ozzy apparently had even started making some t-shirts that said Blizzard of Oz as early as this time period, thinking that he wasn't long for the band. And they actually, for a very, very short period of time, brought in a guy named Dave Walker. And Dave Walker actually was involved with them writing some of the songs and even some of the lyrics, thinking that he was going to be a long-term part of this band now. But it was very short-term, and Ozzy came back, and they put the band back together, recorded Never Say Die, and then you know what happened after that, which is so funny. Because here's this album that they call Never Say Die when they were really ready to collapse. Okay, now, so with this context that makes this stuff so interesting. So here in this case, the headline is Black Sabbath Surviving Species. This one's from the St. Catharines, Ontario, Canada. And again, this is just a feature from Rolling Stone. Now, again, look at the picture. And look at the names underneath it. Again, this is so typical. They got the first two right. Members of Black Sabbath are Bill Ward, Ozzy Osbourne, Tony Iommi, and Geezer Butler. And again, they didn't say left to right, so we'll let them off the hook there. But in order, it is wrong because it's Geezer and Tony are flipped right there as to who's who. I always thought Bill Ward was one of the coolest looking rock stars ever, by the way. I always liked Bill Ward. He's so cool. Okay, let's get into this, and I think you'll find this one interesting as well. We've obviously got what the people want, said Black Sabbath lead singer Ozzy Osbourne before the British band's first United States appearance in 15 months. It's aggressive music, and I think America likes aggression, he said. What Osbourne says America wants is clearly what it gets. Back on the road for a 6-week, 10th anniversary tour of arenas in late August and September, Black Sabbath played its ear-splitting Downer rock in 26 U.S. cities, and the band recently released its 7th Warner Brothers album. It's actually their 8th album. Sometimes they get those things wrong, but Never Say Die is in the sequence of things is their 8th album. Let's see here. Vintage Sabbath with little melody and lots of heavy riff. What's not so clear is why people still want what Sabbath has to sell. Spawned in the era of Manson and Miley and propelled to the big leagues in the early 70s with singles like Paranoid and War Pigs, Black Sabbath was very much a product of that age. And the reason they mention Miley, of course, is that was one of the atrocities that people talk about from Vietnam. And we've talked about that on this channel before. You just look at the chaos that was happening in the world, and they bring up Manson right there, and they say that's the world that those first albums, those first songs were being written in, and that's why you get that. And then now we're years later, and they're creating something. Actually, in some of the albums just prior to this, they were starting to do some different things, different experimenting, going little different directions. Let's see, very much a product of the age, a belligerent heavy metal outfit whose music consumed the listener like a deep depression. Today, Sabbath seems like a band without a context, one of the last surviving specimens of an endangered species, but somehow without adapting to the changing times and evolving tastes that have sent many a heavy metal group to the slag we never have been, said the soft-spoken, slightly pudgy Osbourne. A lot of that had to do with the initial drive to sell the band. We created a brand, if you like, a package. But I hope the coffin has been bolted forever on that black magic thing, unquote. And this is kind of an interesting thing because, it talks about them, all the things that had happened, the things that were changing around them. And it's when you listen to them talking in their books about this issue, they started there. Those first albums coming out, they formed in the late 60s, that first album coming out in 1970, and here we are in 1978, and think of all the things that changed during that period. Led Zeppelin was coming into prominence right around the same time they were, but there were so many groups, so many different bands, so many things going so many different directions, and then you start looking at all the things that started happening then through the 70s. You start having punk rock come in, which in some ways, Black Sabbath had that punk rock attitude before punk rock existed. And so, but that started coming into prominence during some of these periods. And then you had disco taking over. And then you had bands like Boston and Journey coming to prominence. And then here they are, kind of feeling a little bit lost. And you actually get that impression. And they'll openly admit it. They talk about the album Never Say Die, and they'll talk about how the thing felt like disjointed and chaotic. Like it just wasn't a great offering to the public. It was just something that they were confused. They didn't know where they were going. They had all the substance abuse. They were having these internal conflicts. And then that's what ultimately, the band started falling apart. Let's see, we created a brand, etc., blah, blah, blah. Still, the group's high-powered sonic assault at New York's Madison Square Garden early in the tour sent 20,000 neck-wobbling teens thrashing around like holy rollers. Quote, I don't profess to be a messiah of slum people, Osbourne insisted before the concert, but I was a backstreet kid, and that little demon is still in there shoving the hot coal in. The aggression I play is the aggression I know, and it's obviously aggression a lot of people have, unquote. Now, this is a pretty interesting thing for him to look back at his roots and talk about what he's bringing on stage, because the other thing that's happening during this period is that first tour with Van Halen, because they took Van Halen out on tour on this tour. And Ozzy's pretty clear about this. He was like, Van Halen was blowing us off the stage every night. And they actually became really good friends with Van Halen. You listened, I think it was Geezer in his book. He says, when we first saw them and we heard You Really Got Me, we were Kinks fans and we loved what they did with that. And then he says, and then I saw Eddie Van Halen playing the guitar and doing his tapping and we're going, what is this? And then even though they got along with Van Halen really well and everything was mostly fine with them, even though Van Halen was kind of in some ways torching them every night. I think it was, I don't remember which one it was, but they talked about how they really kind of felt Van Halen maybe should have been headlining that tour. Well, what they started realizing was that Warner Brothers was using Black Sabbath to get Van Halen out in front of the public. Because they knew Black Sabbath was kind of a draw that people would show up, but they were starting to think that the reason that they put Van Halen touring with Black Sabbath was so that Van Halen could be introduced to the hard rock audience out there through Black Sabbath. And then Black Sabbath was kind of this washed up has-been group, and they could feel it. And it got to the point that Ozzy even started feeling like David Lee Roth was stealing some of his moves and things. It started feeling there was a little bit of tension between them at the time because Sabbath was on the way out and Van Halen was on the way in. They were the new kids. They were the sweethearts of the business at that point, which was also so interesting because if you read Alex Van Halen's book Brothers, he talks about this and says we were so excited to be touring with Black Sabbath because we were huge Black Sabbath fans. As a matter of fact, Van Halen had flirted with the idea of naming their band Rat Salad originally because that's a Black Sabbath song. So anyway, there was a there was a big kind of emotional connection from, Van Halen was there with their heroes, touring with them, and yet every night in these shows, they were kind of upstaging Black Sabbath in the process. So anyway, this is kind of an interesting thing. So let me get back to this. They mellow. Ozzy admitted that the band members have mellowed considerably since moving from the tough working class neighborhood of Birmingham, where they grew up together, the gracious country homes and high income brackets. But this newfound serenity hasn't completely dulled the proletarian rage that's always been the cutting edge of their music and the essence of their appeal. Never Say Die exhibits no real departures from the group's time-proven musical formula. The new album's only notable difference, in fact, is the time spent to produce it. Despite their renowned efficiency in the studio, they recorded 2 of their early albums in a total of 6 days each, and both went platinum. The members of Sabbath spent about a year pulling the latest disc together. And this happens with a lot of bands. And this, you listen to Geezer Butler talking about this, and he says part of the reason was, Tony Iommi would go into the studio to start recording his guitar solos, and he'd record it and redo it and try to get it better and try to get it better. And Geezer to this day is saying his best takes were always the first one, but we would just leave because he would just keep working over and over and over. So they had the resources and the time at this point to just spend time working on an album. And then that happens to a lot of bands. And then that freedom for so many groups actually kind of gets in their way. When they can just do what they want, then they spend way too long, and then the music suffers, interestingly, as a result of it. For the band's legion of diehard followers, it has been worth the wait. They get what Osbourne says they want and what Black Sabbath records have always delivered. Droning, reverberating vocals laid over fast furnace bass lines and screaming guitar leads that chase each other off into heavy metal oblivion, a place the band itself has clearly managed to avoid. Which, again, is so interesting because they seemed to be right on the edge at this moment of heavy metal oblivion. Because, like they said, they were looking at this going, we're actually being sent out to pasture so Van Halen can come in and kind of take over the world. And you can actually see that's where it all was going, because Van Halen, right after this, starts becoming the biggest band in the world. They were headlining not long after this stuff. And so this was actually a really, really challenging time. And so now, they finish this tour, they go through this whole experience, and the time capsule of this is what makes it so interesting, because here this Rolling Stone writer is talking about this, like, yeah, they're giving them the same stuff, people still like listening to it, things seem to be fine, and yet here we are in September 23rd of 1978, and it was April of the following year, April 27th of 1979, when Bill Ward went into Ozzy Osbourne and said, "You're fired." They kicked him out of the band. They realized that there was just nothing that they could not continue on the way they were going. Ozzy had really bad feelings about it because he was thinking, me have substance abuse, all you guys do, and you're kicking me out of the band? So he had very, very bad feelings about that whole thing. And nobody really liked seeing this happen, but they kind of felt like they didn't have a choice. And this is also the time, Don Arden then gets hired as the band's manager. And then, notoriously, that's when Ronnie James Dio gets brought in to take over. And you have that famous line where Don Arden says something like, "You can't have a midget singing for Black Sabbath." I think those are the words he said, because Ronnie James Dio was like 5'3" or something like that. It's a really short dude with this humongous voice. But then, of course, that's when Ozzy really, he got to know Sharon, and Sharon kind of took over his career. And then, like a phoenix, when he could have easily gone off into oblivion, she basically puts this world together and helps him create this new career where he amazingly kind of becomes bigger than Black Sabbath was. Which is just incredible to think about, just how huge he became. Because Sharon, you listen to her talk about it, and she goes, without Ozzy, there just wouldn't even be a Black Sabbath. And so he was such a big deal. And this is, reading these articles, especially this one to me, is such a time capsule of that moment, because even though Ozzy's talking about what he has at his core, like he said here in this article, but I was a backstreet kid And that little demon is still in there, shoving the hot coal in. The aggression I play is the aggression I know, and it's obviously aggression a lot of people have. And so he still had that at his core, but he had things had changed. You know, he'd become, in some ways, he'd become comfortable, like a lot, and the other guys in the band did. And some of that edge was probably lost in the process. And then having all those things fall apart the way they did, strangely, kind of was able to wake that up in both camps. By bringing Ronnie James Dio into Black Sabbath, it kind of brought them back in some way. It gave them new life. It gave them new direction, new energy. And similarly for Ozzy, Sharon picks him up and then guides him into creating this whole new career that just made him, it re-energized that thing that he'd come from back in Birmingham, and he brought that edge back to his music. And then, of course, you know the story from there. Anyway, I love these things because they're these cool little views, timestamps, time capsules, being able to look at what people were saying at the time. And, this was the public face. This is what people were saying about them. But behind the scenes, as we've talked about, so many other complicated things were going on that, now we know about them, and it makes this stuff even more interesting. So I hope you enjoyed this stuff. Thank you for taking the time to visit with me here today. If you're not following the channel, please follow the channel, like the video, and share this with anybody else you think would be interested in this kind of thing. And I would love to hear your comments about this stuff, especially if you saw them during these concerts. Put that down in the comments. I'd love to hear what that was like for you, what you remember from that. And I know a lot of times it's hard to remember the specifics because we're so far removed from them. But one thing I do know that we remember, I know I do from concerts, is I remember what it felt like. I remember just somehow the experience and the energy, what it was like. And especially if you experienced one of those things when Black Sabbath was in that Never Say Die period, that ironic name of Never Say Die, when they were literally about to die, when the band was about to fall apart. What it was like then seeing them with Van Halen. And did you experience that? Did you see that same thing that they talk about now? Anyway, thanks for leaving your comments. We really appreciate that. And with that, have yourself a fantastic day.